In the heart of Gloucester, one 3-storey terraced home has become the focal point of the city's biggest ever criminal investigation. Beneath the yellow tarpaulin, forensic teams have unearthed 3 sets of human remains.
In February 1994, the crimes of the prolific serial killer couple, Fred and Rose West, began to be uncovered.
The West's victims came from far and wide. They were snared by a seemingly innocent couple in an ordinary car who would offer them a lift.
Fred and Rose West targeted vulnerable women and children. They raped them, they tortured them, they murdered them, and all the while, they enjoyed it.
The police investigation unearthed the remains of 12 victims, the result of a killing spree carried out over 2 decades.
Gloucester's Chief Constable says there was little information which could have led them to the Wests.
These two went to extraordinary lengths to prevent detection. It was clear that the activities of Rose and Fred were really in a league on their own. I mean, they were cruel and depraved in their actions against these young women.
These crimes shocked the world. For Fred's brother Doug and his family, there was nowhere to hide.
Rose had changed then. I mean, she got more domineering then. She got this...
Secretive.
No, no. Secretive, and
Yeah.
what she said went, and that was it. It was unbelievable. I mean, he was such a quiet bloke, so you wouldn't credit it. But we'll never ever know what the real reason was.
When you hear about murders, you immediately think about the victim who was affected. But the truth is that individuals who murder also belong to families, sometimes very close families. The impact of knowing that a member of your family is a serial killer is something that essentially breaks the foundations of everything you know, and also means that they are victims as well.
As the grisly details emerged, life for Fred West's family changed forever.
I don't think we'll ever stop living it in some way or another. There's always some reminder. I'm still Fred West's niece. That's never going to change.
Doug West grew up in the picturesque village of Muchmarkle. His recollections of his older brother are completely different to the infamous Fred West we know today.
That's the where we used to live.
The cottage.
Where I was born.
Mm-hmm. You?
Yeah.
And Kitty?
Yeah.
So, at the beach?
It could have been Mother taking it.
Yeah. Grandad in his suit again?
Yeah.
That's Uncle Fred?
Yeah. We all went to church. I mean, I was baptised here. I was confirmed here. You didn't spend half your life in the church. But it didn't make us no less of a Christian. You know, you knew right from wrong. And that's the way we were brought up. Right from wrong, respect your elders, and carry on. Do what you could to help other people. Well, Fred was oldest, then John, then Daisy, then me, and then Kitty and Gwen. He was 5 or 6 years older than me. He was his own person. He was quite keen on woodwork when he was younger, like. I mean, we always said he was Mama's boy. Because he can do nothing wrong, see. That was our opinion, like. But Mother always reckoned he wasn't, because she'd get after him the same as she get after us. But, you know, we always said he was Mama's boy. John and myself, we used to fight like clappers. Fred would never fight. He could get 7 sorts of bells knocked out of him, and he wouldn't retaliate. But that's Fred all over, like. He was very quiet.
When you think about knowing the horror of what Fred did, you can imagine that the only way that you can keep the sanctity of your memories as a child is to eradicate any of the negativity. According to Doug, he did have problems regarding being beaten up by other people. That may mean that it made him very angry. because he didn't have any control in his world. So the minute that he can find people with vulnerabilities that he can exploit, such as women, then he starts using that kind of behaviour towards them.
He was what we used to call Jack the Lad, but he was irresistible to women. If he was going out, he was always smartly dressed. He was a nice-looking person, you know, no denying it. Of course, he had black curly hair as well, which made him even better. He always seemed to have a girlfriend. Whether it was one night or 2 nights, he hadn't been always the same girl, but he always seemed so he liked the women. He didn't tell everybody what he was doing. He didn't know how many he had. He could have 2 on the go at once, but you wouldn't know it.
The fact that Doug remembers Fred being this really dapper, attractive young man, that demonstrates some kind of hero worship, which we'd understand because siblings with younger siblings tend to be held in some high esteem. We see that in Doug. We see him wanting to remember Fred as a good, attractive human being. All the traits that you would associate with a safe person.
Oh, that's Uncle Fred and his motorbike. And the dog.
Well, he was 16 when he had the motorbike, so he used to go into Ledbury to the youth club or dancing, or what was that? And then, of course, he had an accident with a motorbike, and that was the start. He altered then.
So how many bikes did he have?
Just that one.
You still have that one after he crashed it?
Yeah. He didn't do a lot of damage to it.
Just his head?
Took him to hospital for 2 or 3 days, and then he'd come home and he never seemed the same. He was still after the ladies, but he sort of, I can't know how to describe it really. His personality altered then, you know. He was still a member of the family. I mean, he still joined in with everything else, but he'd rather go off with the women than stop with us. So I mean, of course, we can't blame him really, but.
Fred didn't do particularly well at school and was illiterate, but Fred was very clever in other ways. He was quite cunning, a different kind of intelligence. He knew how to get by in the world. He knew how to make people like him. This is all part of psychopathy. He was very manipulative. He was a pathological liar, and he would say what he thought people wanted to hear, and particularly women.
We know that there was an incident involving Fred West basically putting his hand up a young woman's skirt without her consent.
He was following her up the stairs. Well, he put his hand up her skirt and she turned, and whether he lost his balance or whether she hit him, nobody knew, and nobody really knew, but he hit the deck. If he thought he fancied her, he'd do whatever he thought he could to get her attention.
The fact that he had such low boundaries, that speaks volumes, because he clearly sees women sexually, but also doesn't feel that consent regarding their sexual needs is required. That says something disturbing, because it means that at a really early age, Fred sees women as potential sexual objects. He's not thinking about who they are as human beings, and that is how his future plays out.
At least 6 women reported to the police that they'd been the victims of abduction or attempted abduction, and they described their attacker. But it wasn't until Fred West's picture began to appear in newspapers and television, after what was discovered here at Cromwell Street, that both they and the police were able to put a name to the face which had haunted them over the years.
At the end of the day, we were a family. And a bomb went off. And instead of helping pick up the pieces, people just trod all over it.
In 1962, over 30 years before Fred West would become infamous as a serial killer, he settled down in his first serious relationship with Catherine Costello, also known as Rena. She would become his first wife.
We didn't know much about her. And then, of course, he got married on the quiet and then went to Scotland. After they'd come back from Scotland, and She used to come out home with the kiddies, because she had the 2 girls then, and they used to come out home, and she was all right. I mean, she was a giggle.
In 1966, Fred and Rena returned to Gloucester. By now, they had 2 children. The eldest, Charmaine, was Rena's daughter from a previous relationship, and Anne-Marie was their first child together.
The oldest must have been about 4 or 5. Another one would have been 2, 3. They adored the kids. They always seemed quite contented, happy. So that was it. I mean, they had their life, we had ours, and that's how it went on.
Fred came back to Gloucester and lived in a caravan park with his wife Rena and their 2 children. And then he met her friend Anna McFall. They began an affair.
As a man, Fred had an insatiable sex drive, and he didn't see faithfulness as a part of that. He got Anna pregnant, so what we see is a completely low morality and a low conscience around other people's feelings. They are things to be played with. They are things to enjoy. Consequences, they don't matter. And that's Fred throughout his life.
Fred didn't hide his lover's pregnancy from the family.
He used to come out home and he said, I'm going to have another baby. But then, of course, Anne McFall disappeared before she had the baby.
She was very heavily pregnant when she began to be a nuisance to him. It was at that point that Fred murdered her. And her body was buried at Much Markle.
Fred had claimed his first victim, but told those close to him Anne had left to live with her family. Fred's next love interest, however, would have a much bigger impact on their lives.
He was still married to Rena when he met Rose. Rose was 15 at the time, and they met at the bus station. And they got talking on the bus home. He found out where she worked and then sent a gift to her, which was possibly, it was a coat and a dress, and which was possibly his wife, Rena's.
Rose West was an individual who'd been brought up in a very chaotic environment. She'd had abandonment issues. She'd certainly, we think, been abused. And to some degree, she also had challenges with her learning. So her life was difficult, and she was vulnerable. And when she met Fred, she was a 15-year-old impressionable young girl. And she certainly wanted a relationship with him. And to some degree, that was the beginning of her downfall.
Rose was supposed to be the nanny to the 2 girls. And then, of course, it developed from there. And then, of course, Rose started more and more taking over. Then Rena went back to Scotland.
Rena and Fred's relationship was tempestuous, and the arrival of Rose was the last straw for her. So she returned to Scotland, leaving her 2 daughters with Fred and Rose.
By this time, Rose was heavily pregnant, which was their daughter Heather, their first child together.
I didn't say I didn't like her, but I never took to her as so. Well, it was the way Rose was. She was the dominant one. I mean, if she said jump, you asked how I always thought that marriage was a partnership. I was married for 47 years, and we had our difference of opinion, but we never sort of, one was bossing the other one.
Rose and Fred were playing family with the 3 children, but life in the household was anything but happy for Rena's daughters.
At that time, they were living at Midland Road. Now, Charmaine was his stepdaughter, and she disappeared in 1971. Never reported to the police, but just disappeared.
Rena returned to Gloucester to look for her daughter, but also disappeared. The official story was yet again that Rena and Charmaine had simply left. For Doug and his family, Fred had seemed content in his new relationship with Rose. They married in 1972 and went on to have 8 children. They also moved out of Midland Road and into 25 Cromwell Street.
Maybe see them once or twice a year. They'd come over, Fred with all of his brood in a camper van. Occasionally we went Gloucester way, but not unless it was Grandad's birthday mainly. I guess like every family, they've all got their own personalities. I mean, boisterous and noisy. I mean, there was that many of them. Nothing that stands out. I mean, you know, the same as we were.
Was looking for a partner, somebody that he could spend his life with. He's going to be looking for someone with tendencies that
of his house, and he kept adding bits to it. And this was something he would show off. If any family members came round, he'd take them round the house and said, "Look what I've done."
It was a nice house. It wasn't elaborate and it wasn't a slum. It was just like what we're used to there, working man's house, and that was it. It was his home and he had it the way he wanted it.
I think the last time we went, I was about 8, so nothing different to anybody else's house, really. I didn't like the cellar. It was supposed to be the kids' play area, but I wouldn't go down there.
But the alterations Fred made to Cromwell Street were actually for illicit activities going on in the family home.
Rose West was a prostitute, and Fred encouraged her and probably made her become a prostitute because A, it was easy money, but B, more weirdly, he quite liked to look and watch and listen to his wife having sex with other men. As the money rolled in, Fred created this sort of bar, a Caribbean-themed bar, where they had drinks, so he gave the men drinks, so there was no illusion about what was going on there. And this was all happening in the 2 floors above where all the children were.
Well, we had our suspicions then. There was no, you couldn't prove nothing, but I mean, we all had our suspicions, you know, what was going on. Dad, the wife and I used to talk when the kids had gone to bed. They always seemed to be quite happy and contented as they were. So whether he just accepted she was having other men, what, but he didn't seem to mind. He was working, so I suppose what she done in the daytime.
However, the reality of what was happening at Cromwell Street was more horrendous than anyone could imagine.
In 1992, there were allegations made by the youngest children of Fred and Rose West that Fred and Rose had been subjecting them to sexual abuse. It was investigated, they were charged, but the matter wasn't finalised at court for a number of reasons. In relation to the trial of Rose West, Anne-Marie was called to give evidence for the prosecution. She described abuse by Fred and Rose against her, and the inference was that Fred and Rose were both active participants in this abuse.
Fred West abused all the children in his care, particularly the girls. He started when they were very young, and he was relentless in his pursuit of them. They were terrified.
Fred had this sense of entitlement with his own daughters, and so Fred would say, you know, that it's his father's right to be the first person to have sex with them.
When you think about crimes of power, that is the most powerful a human being can be, to exert absolute control and their will over innocent, naive children. If a man is abusing sexually his children, then he's saying that he owns them, they're his, he can do whatever he wishes to do with them. It's reflective of his very broken nature. Whilst we can never hold Rose any more accountable than Fred for her actions, what we can say is, on a nature level, a woman wishing to bring harm to her children that defies what we are, to some degree, automatically programmed to do.
It wasn't just family members that Fred and Rose abused. Many other visitors to the house in Cromwell Street became a victim of their desires.
Here was a family, apparently, living an ordinary life in a terrace house in Gloucester. And that was a scene of girls either coming there because they were running away from a home or something, or actually being abducted off the street. And we don't know what happened to them in there. We can only surmise from the evidence, but it appears that they were subject to some forms of sexual assault, and they were killed. Not at one point, but over a period of time. This was a repeated activity that was going on by Fred and Rose over a number of years.
What we see is that both Rose and Fred enjoyed sexual sadism, and they found a perfect ally in each other.
This was a game about sex and violence and power. And once they'd started, once Rose had bought into this and proved more than a willing partner, then they continued down this path for the next 8 years.
In 1987, their own daughter Heather became one of their victims, and for Fred and Rose, this was the beginning of the end.
I have absolutely no doubt that if they hadn't have murdered their own daughter Heather, then those bodies, the victims, the murders, they would never have been discovered. They would simply have got away with it.
An ordinary end-of-terrace house in Gloucester was a scene of sadistic sexual abuse, torture and murder carried out by Fred and Rose West. Crimes that had gone undetected for over 2 decades.
Because of the comings and goings and the generally shifting population in Cromwell Street, then what happened to these victims might never have come to light at all, with 25 Cromwell Street still keeping its dark secrets.
In February 1994, the police were granted a warrant to search the West family home in Cromwell Street for the first time.
The scale of the investigation was not clear at the beginning because it was just a missing persons investigation. We were looking for Heather, one of Fred and Rose's daughters who disappeared.
I come down in the morning, and the wife usually puts the news on before I went to work, and they are about Cromwell Street, because I didn't think no more about it, because I just went to work.
Well, they were searching the house to start with at Cromwell Street, and we didn't know which house. Then it came out that it was 25, but there was no reason why yet. And then that they'd started digging, and when they said that they were looking for Heather, it was just the bottom fell out of the world, because it couldn't be right.
The investigation actually at Cromwell Street in February '94 was preceded by the arrest of Fred and Rose in '92, when there were allegations of child sexual abuse by them on the youngest children. Whilst they were in care, they were talked to by social workers. From time to time, they would be mentioning this family joke, that they called it, that Heather was under the patio. And we started to try and trace Heather, who had disappeared in June '87. What it amounted to was she couldn't be found. She'd completely disappeared off the face of the earth. In February '94, police in Gloucester applied to the magistrates for a search warrant and went to the house, said they were going to search the garden for Heather.
She was a pleasant enough girl. She had a head on her shoulders, like she seemed to enjoy school, and she was doing quite well.
I knew Heather from when we, visited, and as far as I knew, it was what Fred and Rose had told Grandad. She'd gone off to get a job working in a holiday camp, and you didn't question it. It was going to be a mistake, and it was going to be cleared up, and, you didn't think it was going to turn into the, House of Horrors.
On that day, nothing was found, but the officers returned the following day to continue the search, and Fred was there, and he spoke to one of the officers and said, you know, can we go down to the police station? He went out with the officer, and on the way to the police station, he said, well, I need to tell you, you're digging in the wrong place. Yes, I did kill Heather, and she's in the garden. We recovered initially 3 leg bones, 3 femurs, which indicated there must have been more than one body there.
Well, it was going on for days, wasn't it? Every other day they'd bring out bodies and parts, and I mean, time seemed to go very slow. It was unbelievable to start off with, and then we thought, well, if they're finding the bodies, it's bound to have happened. But when did it happen, or how did it happen? Because we didn't know.
We recovered 9 sets of human remains. We were satisfied at the end of that search that we had recovered all the human remains. The fact that the victims were so young women, some of whom were girls, that in itself, I think, was probably the most shocking part of it. The victims probably did fall into sort of, you know, different kind of groupings. There was the older women, the wife and the friend of Fred's, Catherine Costello and Anne McFall, that were allegedly killed by Fred. Charmaine, of course, was a daughter, and we don't know why she was killed. She was a very young child when she was killed by Rose. Then you have a series of other girls that were killed, and we've no idea what the motivation was for that. And then finally, we have the death of their daughter in 1987, which was perhaps, you know, a different sort of crime.
In total, the police recovered the bodies of 12 victims across 3 locations.
Well, this is where they found Rena's body, eventually. All this round here was nothing but police tents. You couldn't move up here at one time because there was that many press and that here waiting to see what they could find.
It made you feel sick because, well, somebody was dead, but I suppose more than that, they were saying that Fred had done it, and I couldn't put together the uncle that I knew with the man they were talking about.
You had to put a brave face on it, but there was always that underlying thing, well, did he or didn't he?
When you find out new knowledge about people that you thought you knew, you don't want to believe it. So you start to form pictures around how things must be incorrect because it doesn't fit with your worldview. But then over time, as you start to make the pictures fit together, then you only have really one option, which is to completely reject that individual from your life. So the actual explosion emotionally and then the collateral damage long term is irreparable.
I can still remember standing in the archway between our living room and dining room when it came on the TV that they'd found Heather, and my back hitting the wall and sliding to the floor. And it was a dream, it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And I can feel that now, like I did then.
Because the way he was with kiddies, he was that sort of father. He'd play with them, but thinking that he'd hurt them was a bit unbelievable, to be honest. It didn't seem right. It didn't work out true, you know. It must have happened, but you don't think that people are capable of it.
You can't explain to people that at 11 years old, I was having nightmares that it could have been me. That I'd sat on top of that patio and played on top of my cousin's remains. that the girls had asked me to stay the last time we went to visit. Stay overnight. Your Uncle Fred will drive you home tomorrow. And I wouldn't stay. I mean, you know, in the back of your mind, you've got what if.
In Gloucester, at 25 Cromwell Street, the true horror of what had been happening there was now clear. Fred and Rose West's 12 victims had been identified, and a worldwide media frenzy took hold.
It was everywhere. On the TV, the radio, outside the front door with the press, inside the front door with the police. You couldn't get away from it. It was like being in a living nightmare. This infamous Fred West that was plastered all over the papers and the TV was not my Uncle Fred. It wasn't, they weren't talking about the same person.
For Doug and his family, the experience of having the press out there and everybody wanting to interview them, the police wanting to talk to them, would have been terrifying. Because remember, for them, this isn't real. For them, Fred hasn't done this. So they're already potentially thinking that they're innocent people being made to be guilty, and they're probably thinking that the same thing could befall them.
They came to interview Dad. That was scary, because at that time we didn't know, you know, whether they were going to take him as well. Not that I would ever think that he had done anything, but, you know, they were investigating a murder. You don't know what happens.
The press were a major problem for us from the outset, trying to speculate on lines of inquiries. There was also examples of gross inaccuracy, claiming that Fred had killed, I think on one newspaper article, that there were another 60 victims. Well, there was absolutely no foundation for that.
Everybody else disappeared. They all closed the doors to protect themselves, and Dad was the only one the press could find. So it was our doorstep they were sat on. It was our phone that rang in the middle of the night with idiots asking if it was the body shop.
When you have a murderer in the family, people start making assumptions and presumptions about how that individual was formed. Was it the way they were brought up? Stories in the press regarding his mother being an apparent child molester and his father being incredibly violent, they would have been excruciating. Because now Fred isn't the only one with the problem. Now it's endemic within the family.
That's heartbreaking. To watch Dad have to deal with people talking about Gran and Grandad the way they did. The accusations that were made that were complete lies.
He was, to us, he was perfect. He worked, he'd come home, and that was life. He'd correct you if you'd done wrong, but he wouldn't punish you to excess. He threatened to, mind, a time or two, but he never done it.
I still don't know how you all fit in that house, growing up, 8 of you, with Gran and Grandad.
Yeah. 3 boys slept together in one bedroom, 3 girls in another bedroom.
Oh, I suppose. 8 people in a 3-bedroomed house. I mean, the 3 boys shared a bedroom. If Fred disappeared in the middle of the night, they'd ask why. Do people really think that they could be doing something to one without the others knowing what was happening?
Whilst it would make sense that Fred had been beaten as a child, it would make sense that Fred had been molested as a child, but that doesn't mean that it happened.
On January the 1st, 1995, Fred West was in Winson Green Prison, awaiting trial for 12 charges of murder. He had one more shock in store for his family.
We were at home. The phone rang. I think Mum answered and called Dad and came out and he said that it was Uncle John and that Uncle Freddie killed himself. Which was just... It's like you don't want to hear it, or you can't hear it. It doesn't want to go into your brain. And then when the policeman knocked on the door and said, "I've come to tell you," then it was... It really happened then. It was... And the press were out the front, and the whole house was just lit up with lights from the cameras, all shouting for answers.
Coming out of a shock. He was my brother, and I still always remember him as he was. I really wanted to have a face-to-face with him, and then, because he couldn't tell a lie to me. I mean, that's why I was open to see if I could find out what he really did know and what he didn't know, but of course, he went on himself beforehand, so that put paid to that.
People we were friends with were more worried about how we were coping. Other people were...
That was it. I mean, nothing we could do about it.
For Doug, when Fred killed himself, he was still his brother. He was still a father. He was still an uncle. He was still a friend. He was all of those traits that have pain associated where loss is concerned. Coming to terms with a loss is a struggle enough. But coming to terms with the loss of a man who's so hated by everybody else, that's a struggle, because no one's going to accept your grief.
Following Fred's death, Rose West faced trial alone and was found guilty of 10 murders and sentenced to life in prison. Although the press interest in the family subsided, life for the families of the victims will never be the same again.
A couple of them wrote and said that, you know, they weren't blaming me. So, but I mean...
The victims' families as well. We lost Heather, you lost Charmaine, Reenie.
Yeah, but that's the price you got to pay, isn't it?
No. I don't think there is any explanation in the world that could put right what was done. He didn't give answers, and I'm sure that she won't ever give answers. I know what they did hurt a lot of people, left a lot of people behind to deal with a life. Not just us.
I still feel so sad for the victims and their families because they never got to know what happened to their daughters and why it happened.
When one of the boxes of human remains were brought out of Cromwell Street, an officer carried it out with great dignity, and that was one of the things that all the officers did. It was a crime scene, but they were determined that they were going to respect the remains of the young women that had died in tragic circumstances.
You don't look back. There's no point. In my opinion, there's no reason to look back. You always look to the future. I've got my family, and you know, you just gotta make your own life the way you want it.
We were the killer's family, but we were the victim's family as well. We lost people. I mean, the other victims' families, they're never going to get the real answers. They know what happened, but they're never going to get the answers they want, because we couldn't. They're never going to know, why was it my daughter? Why was it my sister they chose? Nobody's ever going to know. And that, no matter how much you push it away, sits in the back of your mind. And just, if you let it, would just drive you mad.
Richard Ramirez, a drifter from El Paso, to give descriptions to police that resulted in a composite drawing being released, and wanted posters went up everywhere.
What had started as burglaries to fund his drug habit had soon escalated into a series of brutal and horrific murders. All his victims were complete strangers.
When you think about the profile of a psychopath, Richard Ramirez doesn't just fit it perfectly. It's almost like the definition was written for him.
He was the first case where I would actually go to bed at night, never telling my wife that I would keep my gun right next to the bed.
Believing he was acting on behalf of Satan, Richard Ramirez would become one of the most famous and revered serial killers of all time.
At his arraignment, Ramirez pleaded innocent, but displayed a pentagram on the palm of his hand and exhibited bizarre behavior.
Richard Ramirez killed at least 13 innocent people, and his actions tore apart his own family.
He killed people and hurt people, and he tormented a lot of people mentally and physically.
When you hear about murders, you immediately think about the victim who was affected, and you think about their direct family. But the truth is that individuals who murder also belong to families, sometimes very close families, and also means that they are victims as well.
I am his niece, and what he did is what he did. I'm definitely not. My first memory of him, I remember when he used to call a lot and leave like messages on the answering machine, and he'd always talk to me on the phone and say he was coming, and I would be waiting for him, like thinking, okay, like he's coming, but he never showed up. And then when he did, I was sleeping. I remember like one time he was in the living room sitting down, and I gave him a hug, and that was it. I don't really remember other than after that he went to jail.
Shelley Ramirez's father, Robert, was the older brother of Richard Ramirez, and the day that her uncle, the Night Stalker, was arrested was a turning point in her life.
He was actually getting on the Greyhound to come back over here with my dad and my mom and to Catalina, and he didn't make it, obviously. The day that my dad found out that he was in jail, it just kind of like interrupted all the television channels, and it said breaking news, you know, that they had caught Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
Police matched fingerprints found in a stolen car, linking Richard Ramirez to all the murders. His picture was in newspapers and on television.
He's still just watching it like he's seen a ghost or something. Like, that's how he looked. Like, I mean, his face was all pale, I remember, and he just like had tears. Like, he wasn't even like crying like dramatically. It was just like tears were coming down his face. And I was like, Dad, what's wrong? And I remember I wiped his cheek, and he was just like, I don't know, like, I guess, like, he got really mad about what he saw or something, because he got me, like, my dad's never, like, at that point, my dad had never hit me, so he just got me, and he spanked me so hard that it scared me. I remember, like, urinating my pants, because, like, it scared me so hard, and I started crying, and I ran to my mom, and she's like, she comes out, and she's like, what the hell is wrong with you, to my dad? And my dad was just like, look, and my mom was brushing her hair, and she was, like, holding the comb up, and she's like, oh my God, Robert.
The police arrested him and charged Ramirez with what had become known as the Night Stalker murders.
Shelley Ramirez was just a young girl when her uncle was arrested for crimes that were beyond comprehension.
We left that night, and we drove, and we got my grandma, my grandpa, and in the morning we were at the county jail, and I remember there was all kinds of cameras and stuff flashing in my face, and my mom was walking with my dad's sister, and my grandma was on the right side. My grandpa was really sad. He was walking in the back. I don't remember who was walking with him. I think my dad. And like, I think that hurt my grandpa a lot. Like, he never expected that. Like, he was in denial, like, a lot. He couldn't believe that that was his son that did that.
The Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, was arrested on the 31st of August, 1985. He committed his first murder in the summer of 1984, but it wasn't until the following March in 1985 that he embarked upon a frenzied killing spree spanning 5 months, and he claimed at least 12 more victims.
The circumstances were violent and brutal and bloody too. And it really baffled journalists, it baffled residents of Los Angeles, and the police were at wit's end to try to figure out, was there something that tied all these together? Especially as they became more and more prevalent and more violent, and more of the details began coming out. It scared people a great deal. Gun sales were up, lock sales were up, and people didn't know, should they suspect their neighbors?
Richard Ramirez's crimes were absolutely horrific. He raped, he mutilated, and he murdered completely random individuals with no relationship with him at all. The victims that he chose would have suffered the most incomprehensibly terrifying deaths.
Richard's thing was getting in his car and driving out to the suburbs and killing people. We're heading to Glendale, and we're heading to the one of the crime scenes, actually, where a couple were murdered. This is actually a very gruesome crime scene. Up until now, most of the crimes had been committed with a gun. In this instance, he attacked Mr. Needling with a machete, and he told investigators later his goal was to behead him, and sliced up Mrs. Needling as well. And it's a bloody and gruesome crime scene. It's horrific. How is it that this couple got picked, became the lottery winners in the Richard Ramirez Summer of Murder? Doesn't make sense. You know, those poor people, I mean, they certainly didn't know.
Eventually, the newspapers and the television put a name to this, a Valley Intruder.
Ramirez was building himself a reputation in LA, and fearful of getting caught, he began to commit his crimes further afield.
We were aware in San Francisco of a Valley Intruder who was breaking into homes and killing individuals during hot prowl burglaries in the Los Angeles area. It wasn't a high priority in the San Francisco area. That changed on August the 17th, 1985. When I arrived, we walked through one of the most horrific crime scenes I have witnessed in my 22 years. We witnessed Mr. Pan in the bed with a bullet wound in his head. He was dead. We then saw in the kitchen area where the suspect had eaten the food from the refrigerator, regurgitated that food on the floor. There was a satanic symbol drawn on the living room wall, and then the individual masturbated on the carpet. Mrs. Pan had been removed from the house when we arrived. She eventually died. She had been raped and also shot by the intruder. This crime was committed by a very sick, perverted individual.
I know that he used to go in through the windows. He would be in all black. He would listen to like really hard heavy metal. He'd be high. Like he would get on whatever drug, you know, just like the fast-paced drug, you know, and he would just be listening. He liked AC/DC a lot, but he also liked Michael Jackson, for those that don't know. In the beginning, he was just like going through the houses, like, and taking what he knew was of value. But then after a while, it got sloppy, where he was, I mean, just like throwing everything around, and he didn't care. And that's when he started getting really dark. Like, that's when, like, it really got bad.
We put out an all-points bulletin alerting all police agencies up and down the state of California as to what we had, basically stating the evidence from the crime scene, and also that the bullet that killed the victim and also at that time wounded his wife was from a .22 revolver. Once we received confirmation that that .22 bullet was identical to several of the cases in the Los Angeles area, immediately There was high alert news media, television, newspapers, radio. It was out everywhere, and the name changed from the Valley Intruder to the Night Stalker.
How can he not feel empowered by that and feel that, he's got some, right to go in and harvest souls as a disciple of Satan? Later on, he tells people this. He was a unabashed Satan worshiper, and this was all part of Satan's grand plan for the residents of Los Angeles.
We're calling him the Night Stalker. I think that just gave him more of a want to do it and live up to that name and to show everybody that that's how he was doing it, getting in at night. And the scariness of the Satanism with the blood.
After a reign of terror lasting 5 months, the police were finally able to match key evidence left at various crime scenes across California. And the man they knew as the Night Stalker was identified as Richard Ramirez.
The sheriff from Los Angeles Sheriff's Office asked us not to move forward, to wait till they put their cases together. I told our chief, definitely not. We could not. Our case was made. We had an arrest warrant. If anybody died in the next few hours and we were sitting on this information without alerting the public, it would be on us.
So on a Saturday morning at the end of August in 1985, the front page of the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner carried a mugshot of the Night Stalker. And wouldn't you know it, he goes into a liquor store in East Los Angeles. Everybody in LA has been following this story. And people in this East Los Angeles neighborhood are now declaring to one another that they've got the Night Stalker in their midst. And it becomes sort of a chase. And people in the neighborhood catch up to him and they begin to administer a beating. And then the police come.
I'm telling you, he wasn't always bad. Like everybody portrays him to be like, what he did was extremely bad, and I'm not defending it in any way, but aside before that, if everybody would have known him before then they would have understood that it got out of control and it was something he couldn't control anymore.
The infamous serial killer Richard Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas in 1960. He was the youngest of 5 children born to Julian and Mercedes Ramirez.
My grandpa was real warm. My grandma, she just was quiet, and maybe she just felt depression or something, I don't know. My uncle Julian, he's the oldest. My dad, Nacho, Richie, and Rosa.
There's things about his upbringing that I've always found kind of fascinating. He grew up in a very Catholic family. He was an altar boy. And this was a family that was very steeped in Catholic tradition. They went to Mass all the time. They prayed a lot.
My grandfather worked in Juarez. He was a police officer. My grandma, when she was pregnant with Richie, she used to work at a paint factory. And back then, they weren't aware that the paint, inhalation, the smell and stuff was bad for you to inhale. So that's what ended up, they said, the doctors at that time, is what kind of gave him birth defects where he had epilepsy.
Richard suffered with epilepsy from the age of 6. There were many incidents in his life that may have caused this.
He had a severe head injury at a young age. And, investigators will tell you that a lot of these guys that are serial predators and serial criminals have this history of head injuries that occur at a young age, and it unbalances their chemistry. And it causes them to become sort of brutal, vicious killers. Because if you look at the rest of Richard's family, you really don't see this. You see the superstitious, God-fearing, good Catholics.
However, Shelley says her grandfather, Richard's strict Catholic father, was often violent.
All of them. They all got hit. I think the only one that really didn't get hit was Richie, because he's the baby. Or he was a baby. He was a spoiled little brat. My grandpa would get mad and he'd come home and he'd get a hammer, hit himself in the head with the hammer. They'd see him bleed.
That kind of self-brutality and witnessing that kind of brutality is certainly going to have had an impact on Richard's development. Firstly, it's his father. Secondly, it's violent. The fact that his father potentially was such a self-harmer demonstrates that there could have been some quite severe mental health issues.
Richard was also exposed to people in his life who, weren't good practicing Catholics. He had a cousin who was a Vietnam vet that came back from Vietnam with Polaroids of women that he had raped and murdered as a soldier. And he showed those to Richard and, got Richard kind of fantasizing about what it would be like to kill somebody.
I don't really know what happened to him. I just know he went to war and he had like his, the people he was in the war with, that they would take pictures of him, and he showed my uncle a lot of gruesome stuff.
One of the things that we know about Richard Ramirez is that just before he reached adolescence, he had exposure to some really, really violent snuff porn. His reaction wasn't necessarily negative. So lots of people see images that make them feel deeply uncomfortable. But that's the point, that you would recoil from those images. So for Richard Ramirez, it may have been in those moments where he was shown that porn that he realised that he had a particular predilection.
As Richard began to get immersed in the violence of this cousin, he was there as a preteen one night when the cousin pulled out a gun and shot his wife in the face. Richard witnessed that. You can imagine that this kind of thing is happening probably at the time, 12, 13, when he's having a sexual awakening.
He was scared. He hid behind the couch and he didn't know whether to run or what to do. He was in shock. To the point, it just really scared him. And then afterwards they went, and that was the first time that he got high, smoked marijuana. And then after that, it led on to another drug and another drug. But it wasn't because he wanted to, it was just he didn't know how to cope with it. He didn't tell anybody. He held all that inside.
What's really shocking about Richard's behaviour is after his cousin has shot his wife, instead of leaving the house and screaming for help or calling an ambulance, he goes instead with his cousin and smokes a joint. That kind of behaviour is not consistent with somebody who is terrified of what has just played out. So again, we're giving this little indication that Richard has a very dark association with things that he enjoys.
Coming from a large family, when he was growing up, Richard was exposed to some of the seedier sides of life by older relatives.
There was another family member who was a notorious peeping Tom and a hot prowler. And he taught Richard how to sneak up on people and how to, watch people in their rooms having sex or undressing. The voyeurism of that, the, budding sexuality of a young man, the fact that he's already been exposed to all this sort of, violent paraphernalia, it had to have an effect on him. He didn't graduate high school. He left high school at an early age, came to California, and lived as a transient, essentially. As a young man, he smoked a lot of weed, he took LSD, he came to LA, and he became really heavily involved in crack cocaine.
While living in California in his early 20s, Richard would commit burglaries to fund his drug habit.
A lot of these people lived in middle-class neighborhoods and tiny middle-class homes that were just easy to be burglarized. And everybody's got jewelry, right? Wedding ring, necklace, heirloom stuff. Richard knew that, and that's why he targeted these people.
Alarm systems and all that was like nothing to him. So he was able to break into the houses, go in through their windows, and he would do what he did.
This is the kind of place where a guy like Richard would take stolen jewelry, sell it. Anything you took from a theft, you could easily sell it over here. And the thing is like over in Skid Row, you could buy drugs too, openly.
In the neighborhood where he lived, at the, in the Cecil Hotel. It's right on the edge of Skid Row at that time.
It's a pretty notorious place. Richard Ramirez isn't the only serial killer that lived there. And it's got this really kind of a creepy history, that extends back decades. If you were coming into Los Angeles from El Paso like Richard, you would probably walk straight up Main, and this would be the first place you'd see. And, it wasn't an expensive place, so this was Richard's headquarters in Los Angeles. He, stayed here. He'd go out and do his little, dirty deeds and then come back here.
But Richard wasn't only heavily involved in drugs.
As Richard grew older and began taking more and more drugs, he began to become firmly entrenched in his Satanism. That was a big part of his life.
Initially, he had strong Catholic beliefs. Having been raised a Catholic myself, you're good, you're with Christ. When you're bad, you're with Satan.
He had a kind of special room in there that he kind of outfitted to be more satanic or more evil. I think he lived there at least for most of the summer of '85.
Partying with like a different kind of crowd that, like a kind of like a cult. Back then, like, I guess he had joined into like some kind of like satanic cult. And I think that wasn't just all like my uncle now. I think his childhood, I think who he was hanging out with, drugs and Satanism, was a lot of stuff. And it just all triggered it. And the people that could have helped him didn't help him.
The idea that anyone can give an excuse to a pathological serial killer who raped and violated and mutilated individuals in the most terrifying, humiliating and murderous of ways, to suggest that they could have been helped is to deny any responsibility. The truth is, there are people in this world who have the most diabolical experiences and they receive no support. And they go on to live loving, caring relationships. They go on to become good, decent human beings. Richard Ramirez was somebody who thrived on making people be in pain. And that is something that would never have changed in his nature, no matter how much help you gave him.
The killing was spread out over a wide area of Los Angeles County. A map with pins marking locations of murders, 13 of them, and assaults, vicious attacks, showed that Ramirez moved quickly, killing and leaving, heading to another area to kill again.
I think once he turned that corner and started committing crimes and became more vicious, more dedicated to the devil, it justified everything evil that he was doing.
Following his arrest in 1985, serial killer Richard Ramirez was held in prison while awaiting trial. And his family stood by him.
My dad used to write to him like every weekend. He'd sit at his bar. We had a bar inside our home, and he would sit there and just listen to his music, his AC/DC, because my dad listens to all the same, kinds of music, and he would just listen to his music and write to Richie for hours. And he would ask me if I wanted to write a letter and send it in there. When I was younger and I first started writing to him, I only knew that he was just in jail. I really didn't know why or anything. I wasn't really allowed to know. When my mom would start recording any of the, shows or anything that he was coming out on, she never really let me stay in the room and watch that. It was kind of just something so my dad was at work, he could see it later on.
During the early years when Richard was in prison, Shelley grew closer to her uncle, all the while unaware of his horrific crimes.
He'd always write me back and just kind of like laugh and tell me that just to keep writing him. It got to a point like where I didn't even want toys. I just wanted them to pay the phone bill so that I could talk to him and stuff. He would tell me to take care of my dad, my mom, and to say hi to them. Take care of my sister, that he hoped I was well. There was a time I felt like he was just normal. Yeah. I knew that he had done something bad, but like they didn't really want to tell me. My dad and my mom just never really spoke to me about like what he did.
In cases like this, the facts are so overwhelming that burdening a child with that information is often something that parents and relatives don't want to do. So Shelley was protected from these issues. But you do have to ask yourself why her parents would have felt that that was an appropriate relationship to engage in. The wider picture, however, suggests that the family didn't want to disown him. That actually there was a part of the relationship that they felt they wished to connect to. And to some degree, again, that kind of asks you the question, do they really feel that he is as guilty as he should be? Because their actions don't suggest that they believe that.
As the police put together their case against Ramirez, he remained in prison, and it was 4 years before the trial finally began. And once again, Richard Ramirez was determined to capture the public's attention.
The trial was televised live throughout LA, and each and every instance of his brutality was told in court. The case was a circus, though. Intimidating witnesses, mishandling evidence, misstating evidence, and at the same time, Richard was putting on a show. Richard was, coming into court and drawing pentagrams on his hand, and then showing those pentagrams to the reporters and the audience, and telling people, that he was the spawn of Satan.
Who is Satan?
Toward the end of the trial, his defense attorneys brought his dad in, and his dad was an alibi witness. And his dad came up and said, Richard could not have committed some of these crimes because he was in our house in El Paso. Well, all it took was the prosecuting attorney to go back to a copy of the El Paso newspaper and pull it out and say, well, that's interesting, Mr. Ramirez, because on the day your son was arrested, you said you hadn't seen him for 4 years. So how now can you tell us that he was with you during some of these crimes?
The alibi would never have held up in San Francisco, where they had fingerprints and we had DNA positive identification. So the father's alibi was nothing more than a father making excuses and trying to justify that his son could not be so evil.
The father's testimony was blown up. And there's this moment in court when, he steps down from the witness stand and walks by his son, and both of them don't even look at each other. And it's kind of one of the, you can see the sadness in the father's eyes, and you can see the hatred in the son's eyes, and you can see what a broken family they were at that point.
The jury took 22 days to reach its guilty verdicts on all counts. Ramirez chose not to be present for the reading of the verdicts and was taken downstairs to a holding cell where he sat shackled in his jailhouse blue uniform.
Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death in the state of California.
It was one of those feelings of, wow, that summer, that was a crazy summer back in '85. How many people did he kill and how scared we all were? And here it is 4 years later, it still hasn't really worn off. We're watching this with fascination, and he's probably getting the penalty that he deserves. It was really a dramatic moment. That summer, if you lived here then, you'll never forget it. And the trial, as long as it was, and as weird as it was, and all the things that happened, you'll never forget that either. Richard Ramirez was a one-of-a-kind serial killer in the history of Los Angeles.
From the time of his arrest and throughout the rest of his life, Richard Ramirez never displayed any remorse for his crimes.
We took him upstairs from the homicide detail and booked him into our city jail. As the 2 deputies were leading him away, he looked over his shoulder at me, and I had no idea that he knew who I was. And he said, "Hey, Falzon," with a very, very strange smile on his face. He says, "You'd sure like to know about those two old ladies, wouldn't you?" These were two elderly ladies. He broke into their apartment and he started beating him and killed one of them right in front of the other. She ran to the kitchen window, and as she was trying to scream for help, he reached around, slit her throat open as she was screaming. This was a very, very disturbed man.
He actually asked for a psychological profile to be drawn up of him so that he could look at what his mental state was during the killings. And actually what was found was that he did exhibit very high levels of what we consider psychopathy. So the truth is that he's completely sane. He wasn't insane at that point. He was aware of his actions. But if you imagine that psychopathy is an individual who has the volume turned right down on conscience, and also when they see people in pain, they don't register it in the way that you or I would. So instead of feeling moved, instead of wanting to help, actually what's fed back is an enjoyment of seeing that pain. And that's what makes people like Richard Ramirez the people that keep you up at night.
Despite the crimes that Richard Ramirez committed, he began to attract a cult following.
When the news broke and we had Richard Ramirez up in the San Francisco jail, a couple of detectives came in at lunchtime, and I was working at the desk. And they said, "Frank, did you see the line around the corner?" I said, "What are you talking about?" Women lined up down the steps of the Hall of Justice, around the corner up 6th Street. It's about a block and a half of women that wanted to visit this sick individual. It blew me away.
You look at Los Angeles and you think about celebrities, and here you have a murderer who's become a celebrity. So much so that women would come to trial just to be close to him. They would want to get near him. They wanted to be sort of a part of his story.
Like it or otherwise, when people are notorious in the press, when they've committed crimes that are despicable and reprehensible, for some reason, it attracts certain people. Add to that the Hollywood idea regarding the occult. Add to that the fact that he's going to prison for a long time, so he's not going to be any threat to anybody anytime soon, and suddenly you have the cooking pot of attraction.
He wasn't a bad-looking guy. And I think that girls were attracted more to his looks than realizing, hey, you know, he hurt somebody and he really hurt them in a very awful way.
I think this man was living for his 15 minutes of fame. He knew he was a bad person. He knew he had broken the law. He was raised a strict Catholic. He'd given up his Catholic faith. He dedicated himself to the devil. So anything sick, demented, horrific was okay, because he was a sick man. He was a disciple of the devil.
Throughout his trial in 1989, serial killer Richard Ramirez's family worked hard to pay for his lawyers. This would take its toll on his niece Shelley's parents.
When my parents went through their divorce, I was 9, and me and my sister, we used to sit in my grandma's room a lot, and that was like basically our room. She gave up her room for us. My grandpa had already passed away, and my mom and my dad, they had a real difficult divorce, so I wasn't aware of this, but I guess my dad's sister ended up getting custody of me and my sister in the beginning. So, well, first my mom did, and then it changed. They went back and they fought for us, and then she ended up taking custody of us because my dad wasn't, they said, stable enough, which he was, but it's just because there wasn't like a stable residency for him to say, you know, I could take them. It was hard for my dad. Him and my mom, they had their differences, but it was hard for my mom too, but they just... So much bad happened already, like with everything that, you know, and because they should have never tried to help. Like, that's why things kind of went bad for them, I think. I mean, you're trying to get somebody out of jail, or you're trying to, you know, like, get any kind of lawyer that will try and get them, like, the minimal time. It's not gonna work no matter what you do. He took innocent people's lives, and
if you think about Shelley's experiences of family, there's a lot of dysfunction. Richard's gone to prison, her own mother and father have now split up, and that fracture has meant that she's not living with either of them. She's actually going to live with Richard's sister, her auntie. That kind of dysfunction in families is far-reaching consequentially on her emotions. It makes you feel that your connections are fragile. It makes you concerned about the relationships that you have and the future of them, and it really means that any connections that you can have that feel stable, they're the ones you'll invest your time in.
He told me that he thought he was going to be going in for like a long time, and that he hoped that I would keep writing to him. But I didn't. I went to go see him.
More than 6 years after Richard Ramirez had been arrested, Shelley prepared to visit her uncle in San Quentin State Prison.
Grandma gave me a gold cross, and she was like, you know, don't take it off. You know, she told me in Spanish, keep it on. And, you know, I remember, like, she was praying a lot, and she had me sit in the room with her, like, in the rocking chair. And she was just praying, like, in her Bible, just to herself, like, just kind of, like, whispering and praying. And I didn't think anything. I just let it be. And that was the summer that they had separated me and my sister. We went to San Quentin to go and see my uncle. Came out, and they had him, like, all shackled up. And it had been years since they had seen him, and my hair was really long, and he just looked different. He sat down, they untied. There was like a chain around his waist. So they undid that one, but they didn't undo his handcuffs. And I remember he was telling me, like, are you nervous? And I just told him no. And he told me to go and let him talk to my dad's sister. She tells me to go and stand, like, against the wall. And, like, I always had long hair, so I thought, you know, he wanted to see how long my hair was. And I wore a dress, and he just was talking to me, and he was like, that if I wasn't his niece, that he would F me any day. And he started jacking on, like, he stood up, like, as much as he could, because remember, he's shackled still, and he started jacking off. And I tried to turn my face, and I was like, why are you doing that? Like, I just, like, my eyes got watery, and I was, like, trying to go like this, I remember, and, like, kind of just, like, block, you know, like, so I wouldn't look. And he was, like, telling me to look. I started kind of, like, crying, like I had, like, tears going down, like, my face, and I was like, I don't want to. That was it. Like, I didn't talk to him anymore. I didn't even say bye to him.
Shelley's being sexually abused by Richard from prison. How powerful is that? That Richard can get a young girl brought in, he can tell her that he wants to have sex with her. Imagine the message that gives to Shelley, that she has absolutely no power. That is such a damaging key message that you can give to a young woman.
Richard was not your typical prisoner. From, you know, the people that knew him, they'll tell you. Masturbating in front of people that visited him in jail. There's stories of him spitting on people. There's stories of him, you know, still being a avowed Satanist, to the point that he frightened people even though he was behind bars. He never really shed that persona. The only way you can really describe him is being one of a kind, evil, brutal, unremorseful.
In 2013, Richard Ramirez died of liver failure after being held on death row for 24 years.
I think the world is a much better place now that he's gone. I think it was a big mistake that Richard Ramirez was ever born. This was a very sick, demented, cruel individual who, because of his satanic beliefs, justified everything evil that he could think of to inflict on his victims. I don't think much of this man at all.
There was, I think, a sense of relief, like a chapter had come to an end. You know, this evil bad guy that had killed so many people kind of got what was coming to him, even if it didn't come at the hands of the state. And, you know, you didn't hear too many people mourning his death. He relished the fact that he was celebrated for the murders that he committed, and he enjoyed the fact that people looked at him as some sort of devil's angel or devil's disciple on earth. And that was it. End of story. Richard dead.
Shelley didn't mourn her uncle's passing, but she did miss the man she grew up knowing.
He didn't want to do it. I don't think he did. I think that he wanted to stop, and I think that's why he went to my dad and tried to like get help and just start fresh, but it didn't happen that way because it had already called him, like, you know, whatever the evilness that had pulled him in that far and made him do what he did.
Unless you've been in a position where you've had a serial killer in your family, you can never understand Shelley's position. But what you can say is that Richard Ramirez and Shelley are synonymous with one another because she's become part of his wider story. She talks about the crime, she talks about her experiences with him. When you actually take a step back and think about the normal processing, if there ever is a normal processing of dealing with a serial killer in your family, you would imagine that maybe the last thing that you'd want to be associated with was their name.
It doesn't bother me. To me, you know, that doesn't, Richie doesn't define who I am, you know, I define myself. Like, one thing my dad always told me was, like, not to tell people, like, that I was related to Richie, especially here in California, because of the fact that, you know, this is where he did what he did. There's a lot of people that live with pain and that have lived with pain, like, throughout their lives ever since, you know. I can't say sorry to them because it's not going to change the way they feel. I just can tell them that I wish that maybe if I would have been around, I could have talked to him and I could have put him somewhere and helped